Rick Forcier, again, there's not a lot out there about him. He doesn't have a criminal record. There's a few certain people that know some things about him, but a couple things are definitive, but nothing that really is going to slap you in the face. I mean, yeah, I've been slapped in the face by it because, I know the guy personally, and yeah, he's definitely up there high on the list. And I think the reason is because, he stated at first he was home that night, and then he didn't hear anything. And then it changes to, no, I was coming home from work in Franconia. His story is not told to the police until 2.5 months later, that he saw the girl running down the road. And that was because he had been running his mouth in the store.
Maura's car was found on the side of the road at that curve. About 100 yards away on the left-hand side was Butch Atwood's house, and then on the right-hand side was Bradley Hill Road, where Rick Forcier's house was. Now, where his house was not where, because some people get this confused, was not where he claims to have seen Maura. He claims to have seen somebody who matched her description. How many miles away from there, and was that around Hummingbird Lane?
He stated that he saw what he believed to be a young female with a hood running down the road, approximately in the vicinity of Route 116. Now, Route 16, there are two Route 116s off of Route 112. One is Route 116 Benton Road, which goes back down to Bradley Hill, or the other 116 is the one that goes to Easton, and they're about 3/4 of a mile apart. So I'm guessing that he saw, if he's stating that this to be true, that he saw her probably in between the two 116s would be my guess. That is very close to Hummingbird Lane, which is where Greg Floyd lived.
How long was it after the accident that he came forward and said that? And why was there such a delay?
He came forward 2.5 months after. When Frank Kelly, the first PI, talked to him very early on, he told Frank Kelly that he was home that night, laying on the couch sleeping. He did not hear or see a thing. 2.5 months later, when the police came to him because Rick had been at the local store and was talking about how he had seen somebody running down the road that night, what he believes was that night. So then the police went and talked to him, and after talking to him, they decided that his story was viable, and the New Hampshire state police said that they checked his work records and they know that to be true. Well, being a former police officer, if a guy shows me his work records, which he keeps himself because he's self-employed, and they're written in pencil, it indicates to me that I wouldn't say that that's 100%.
And what's interesting is that we've heard conflicting accounts about what he was doing around that time. So in this account, he was driving home from work. We've also heard that he was sleeping on the couch in his trailer, that he's said that on a different occasion. So when you hear conflicting stories, you wonder if someone's lying, right?
Absolutely, and that's why we're talking about it. Also, the account of him seeing a person running didn't come out until several months later.
Yeah.
So he had a different account before that, and then all of a sudden, suddenly remembered this sighting while he was in a store. And he made a joke in the store saying that Maura is a good cook.
And his excuse was that he confused the days. So when people asked him, or probably law enforcement asked him, why are you just remembering this now? He said that he mixed up the nights and he was going through his old records and realized that this was the night that he saw this young person. But it's interesting because after he made this statement, there was a formal search in that area where he said that he had last seen her, which moved some focus away from his backyard.
My name is Guy Peardy. I'm a retired detective lieutenant from the Rutland City Police Department in Vermont. I'm also a retired homicide detective from the state of Vermont as well. I was one of the original people working on the Maura case basically from day one with our league, and happy to be here.
You don't believe that there's any truth to the story that he tells months later that she's running down the road 5 miles, he saw her?
No. Why would he be watching her 5 miles away?
Right.
Were you following her for 5 miles? You saw her 5 miles away? I don't think so.
Yeah.
There's no tracks. I mean, the other thing here is that they had some snow. There's no tracks going off any place. And that's one thing, I give the police. They did note that. The trailer that he was living at the time was a real total piece of shit. And we found out where the trailer was once he started building his new house. So when we went up with cadaver dogs alerted on his trailer. So we said, okay, we're going to back off, because it's now an area where we could search and maybe find DNA.
So at this time when you took the cadaver dogs, the trailer was on his property or had been moved?
Moved.
Okay.
He had started building his new place there. And so again, called HE, called this, called that. We discussed doing a real crime scene of the trailer and, looking for DNA or looking for stuff. But when we talked to the HE about it, they said that they were going to take a look at it.
They found him suspicious enough that they would take the time and energy to actually do the search in 2009 of his recently sold house. So they did see him as suspicious.
Yeah, I mean, I would think they would have had enough on Forcier to get a warrant for the house, even without getting any hint of anything specifically in his house, just based on him being so ridiculous and making claims that he saw her that night. But maybe not, so maybe his comments were not enough. At least for whatever judge they went to or grand jury.
And I mean, I think that the way that we'd always heard it is that he was overheard making comments and then was alerted to the police, and then they subsequently spoke to him. He didn't, come forward.
Right.
So, I mean, if he was sort of BSing, or somebody took something out of context and then he just corrected it after the fact.
Maybe they dismissed the early reports about him saying that he had sex with her as a joke, or made up by somebody else about him.
Yeah, that might be a reasonable explanation enough that they can't necessarily use that to get a warrant. The only thing that I just can't understand or reconcile is the fact that 3 months later, in May, he claimed to see her, or someone matching her description, running down the road.
Right.
And according to Lieutenant Scarinza, they took that sighting as credible. I definitely did not agree with all of the conclusions that seemingly the New Hampshire League investigators drew from the evidence that they had about Forcier.
Yeah.
But I do think it gives you a sense of where their heads were at and the mind frame that they were sort of evaluating all incoming information through. And if it's true that the police were also sort of had a similar viewpoint, then it's good to know.
Yeah.
I don't know, I think cops generally and detectives, usually the suspect is pretty obvious. It's almost always the boyfriend or somebody who is very obvious and they don't actually have to do a lot of detective work. Usually your hunches are correct. Usually you're going to be able to trust them. And so you're perhaps going to have almost too much faith in your ability to tease people out.
Yeah.
So it's almost like there might be an obvious bias or something. Of course it's the guy who lived right across the street. Who else would it be? It's just because it's always the most obvious answer.
Yeah, and there's obviously a confirmation bias there too, right? Because you're gonna solve the cases where it's the obvious person, And you're not going to solve the cases where it's not the obvious person, but that doesn't mean you don't still think it's the obvious person. It's just you couldn't prove it.
Exactly.
So, yeah, you're not going to find too many cases where you know for a fact that the perpetrator was the non-obvious suspect, just because those are the hardest cases by definition.
Right.
Yeah, it's hard to say, should we trust the intuition of the police that it is the guy that they think it is, or the fact that they were never able to get him, does that mean that they were wrong and they should start looking somewhere else? Or is the fact that they weren't able to get him an indication of some other thing? He's protected by the state police or whatever for being a CI or a witness or something.
I think all of those are possible. I think the most likely, most probabilistic is that if there's no evidence and they tried really hard to find some, it's probably not him.
I definitely think Forcier is shady. Whether he did it, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if it was him, but I'm not convinced. The stuff that the police seem to think is like super incriminating, I don't find all that incriminating. It seems more like the behavior of like a weirdo. Like weirdos do weird things. Like people could say things to incriminate themselves even without being guilty.
Right.
Just by being a little bit unhinged and being the subject of an investigation. Like once you're in the crosshairs, anything you say that's like weird is going to make police think that you're guilty. So
yeah,
if you fail to dispel their suspicions, you're going to be their suspect, and they're going to interpret everything, to mean that it's you.
Right. I mean, the one thing I keep going back to is they couldn't get a warrant.